He had everything: the company, the money, the power. The one thing he could not build was a family. So he did what powerful men do. He hired someone. He found the perfect candidate: young, healthy, intelligent, every medical marker exceptional. He was ready to sign. And then the doctor handed him a folder and said 4 words that stopped him cold. "She has never been touched." He stood at that window. Boston Harbor below him, everything he had built around him, and for the first time in 6 years, Dominic Hale did not know what to do. Because the woman in that file was not naive. She was not broken. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was someone who had looked at her own life honestly, who had chosen, deliberately, to do something extraordinary with it. And he almost took that choice away from her without ever asking what it cost. What happens when a billionaire is forced to truly see another person? What happens when a woman who has never been seen finally is? Stay with me. This story will surprise you. The lesson this story carries: you do not have to have lived everything to know who you are. And sometimes the most powerful thing another person can do is simply see you clearly. If this story finds you at the right moment, like it, share it, leave a comment below. Your words bring these stories to people who need them. Subscribe so you never miss one. Now, let's begin.
The door closed too quietly. That was the first thing Dominic Ashford Hale noticed. Not the sound of it shutting. The absence of sound. The careful, deliberate way Dr. Sylvia Harmon pulled it closed behind her, as if the room needed to be sealed before she could say what she had come to say. He was already sitting at the long glass table when she entered. 14th floor, the private medical suite at Hale Biosciences headquarters in Boston. The room smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, the kind of clean that did not happen by accident, the kind of clean that was maintained on purpose, every day, by people whose job it was to make sure nothing messy survived in this space. Dominic had chosen this room for exactly that reason. Dr. Harmon stood 3 feet from the table. She held a manila folder against her chest, both arms crossed over it. She had not offered it to him yet. He noticed that too. "Just tell me," he said. She set the folder on the table between them. She did not sit down. "All the medical markers are excellent," she began. Her voice was steady, professional, the voice of a woman who had delivered difficult information before and had learned to do it without flinching. "Hormone levels are strong. Uterine lining is ideal. The genetic panel came back clean. She is a strong candidate medically. Exceptional, actually. One of the strongest we have screened in 3 years. But," Dominic said. Sylvia looked at the folder, then at him. "During the psychosocial intake interview, some information came to light." She paused. "Information I am required to disclose to you before we proceed. It changes the nature of informed consent for her." He waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things he did better than almost anyone he knew. Most people filled silence with noise. Dominic had learned, a long time ago, that silence was where the truth lived. You just had to be patient enough to let it surface. "Claire Marsh has never been in a physical relationship," Sylvia said. "Of any kind. She is, by her own description during the interview, completely inexperienced." The air conditioning hummed. Dominic did not move. "She is 27 years old," he said. His voice came out flat, even. The voice he used when something surprised him, and he did not want it to show. "Yes. And she applied to carry my child." "Yes." He stood, slowly. He walked to the window. Boston spread out below him, in gray November light. He could see the harbor from here. He used to love that view, the water changing color with the weather, the boats moving in and out. He had stood at this window 100 times in the last 6 years, and not once had he actually seen any of it. "Did she know," he said carefully, "what the full process involves? Not just the IVF procedure itself. The physical requirements, the monitoring appointments, the examinations, She read the contract, Sylvia said. All 43 pages. She signed the disclosure of procedures. She initialed every page. That is not what I asked. Sylvia was quiet for a moment. I think, she said, that she understood it intellectually. I am less certain she understood it experientially. Dominic turned from the window. He looked at Sylvia Harmon. He had worked with her for 2 years. She was precise and ethical, and she had never once told him what he wanted to hear if it was not the truth. He had hired her specifically for that quality. He had not expected it to feel like this. Something cracked open inside his chest, just slightly. A seam, a fracture line running through the careful architecture he had built around himself over 6 years. He did not name it yet. But something shifted. He said, "What do we do?" "That," Sylvia said quietly, "is entirely up to you." 4 days earlier, the Botanical Garden in Concord, Massachusetts. October had left its last color on the trees near the entrance. The maples were burning orange and red. The air smelled of fallen leaves and cold soil, and something underneath both of those things, something green and alive and persistent, the smell of things that refused to stop growing just because the seasons said they should. Claire Marsh was on her knees in the propagation house. Her hands were deep in a tray of soil. She was pressing cuttings in with careful, practiced fingers, each one at the same depth, the same angle, the same deliberate placement. She had been doing this for 4 years. Her hands knew the work before her mind did. She was not unhappy. That is the first thing to understand about Claire Marsh. She was not a sad girl waiting for someone to arrive and change her life. She was not lonely in the way that people use that word as an excuse for wanting something they are afraid to name. She had built a life from the materials available to her. A small life, a quiet one, but a good one. She woke at 6 every morning. She made coffee in the kitchen of her apartment in Somerville. She drove to the garden. She worked with her hands in soil. She came home. She made dinner. She wrote in her journal. She slept. On weekends, she called her mother. She walked along the Charles River. She read books she got from the library. She went to bed early on Sunday nights and felt, in a way she never examined too closely, satisfied. But in the private hours, the ones between finishing the journal and falling asleep, there was something she circled around without quite landing on. Not unhappiness, not longing exactly, more like the awareness of a door she had never opened, not because it was locked, just because she had never tried the handle. 3 weeks ago, she had seen the brochure on the library bulletin board. It was light blue. There was a photograph of a woman in a garden on the cover. The woman was smiling at something outside the frame of the picture. The brochure was for a surrogacy agency called New Horizons Family Services. Claire had stood in front of that bulletin board for 2 full minutes. She was not impulsive. She thought things through. She researched before she decided anything. She had once spent 3 weeks researching the best type of soil amendment for the garden's propagation house before ordering anything. But she took the brochure without thinking. She just reached out and took it. The money was real. Of course it was real. Her mother's property tax bill was 6 months past due. The barn roof on the Marsh family property in Vermont had been failing for 2 years. Ruth Marsh had never once asked Claire for help, and Claire had been trying to figure out a way to give her some for a long time. But it was not only the money. Claire had thought about this honestly, the way she thought about most things. She wanted to do something that mattered with her body, something that went beyond the daily maintenance of being a person alive in the world. She had never used her body for anything extraordinary. She worked hard, she walked, she slept. Her body was a tool she kept in good condition because she needed it to work. The idea of carrying someone, of being the bridge between a wish and a life. That appealed to her in a way she could not fully put into words, but could feel clearly enough in her chest. She filled out the application. She went to the first screening. She answered questions about her health, her family history, her emotional stability. Then a woman in a beige cardigan asked her, gently, about her relationship history. Claire answered honestly. She always answered honestly. It had never once occurred to her to do otherwise. The woman wrote something down. Claire did not think much of it. She drove home. She made soup from the last of the garden tomatoes. She called her mother and talked about the weather. She slept well. Back in the medical suite, Dominic picked up the folder. He opened it. The first page was her medical summary. He already knew it was excellent. He turned to the second page, her biographical intake form. He read about a small town in Vermont called Whitmore, population 800. He read about homeschooling and a botanical scholarship and a job at a garden and a barn that needed a new roof and a mother who had raised her alone. He read about why she had applied. The intake form said, candidate states primary motivation as contribution. Desire to create life that will persist beyond herself. Secondary motivation is financial support for aging parent. Candidate demonstrates an unusual degree of self-awareness regarding emotional expectations. He read the interviewer's note at the bottom. Candidate was asked to describe her understanding of the physical requirements of the surrogacy process. Her responses suggest thorough intellectual preparation, but limited embodied experience. Flagged for ethical review. Dominic closed the folder. He sat back down at the glass table. He thought, I have spent 6 years building a process for getting what I want. I have hired the best doctors and the best lawyers and the best agency in the country. I have done everything correctly. I have left nothing to chance. And now a 27-year-old woman who had never been touched by anyone was sitting somewhere in the city waiting to hear whether she got the job. He sat with that thought for a long time. The harbor was still gray outside the window. He picked up his phone, set it down, picked it up again. He did not call anyone. He sat in the cleaned air of the medical suite and stared at the water and thought about what kind of man he was going to be about this. He called Theo Calloway at 7 that evening, not from the office, from his home study in Beacon Hill. The house was large and very quiet in the particular way that large houses are when someone has lived in them alone for years. The furniture was good quality and carefully chosen, and nothing was out of place. And it looked, if you stood in the doorway of any room, like a photograph of a home rather than a home itself. Theo arrived 20 minutes after the call. He came directly from whatever he had been doing. His jacket was slightly rumpled, and he was carrying a legal pad that already had notes on the first page, which meant he had been thinking on the way over. That was what Dominic paid him for. The thinking on the way over. They sat across from each other in the study. Dominic had not poured drinks. That told Theo something. She signed everything, Theo said. He set the legal pad on the arm of the chair. He had already reviewed the file twice. I know she signed everything, Dominic said. Then legally, she is a fully consenting. I am not asking you a legal question. Theo put the pen down. This was the thing about Dominic Ashford Hale that most people in his professional orbit got wrong. They assumed that his coldness was the absence of feeling. It was not. It was compression. Everything he felt, every reaction and response and emotion, he pressed down into a very small and very dense space somewhere deep in his chest. The result was a man who appeared impenetrable, who moved through rooms and boardrooms and difficult conversations as if he were made of something harder than the rest of the world. But Theo Calloway had worked for him for 9 years. He had seen the compression under pressure. He recognized the particular stillness that came over Dominic when something had gotten through. Something had gotten through tonight. "Tell me what you are actually asking," Theo said. Dominic was quiet for a moment. "She is 27 years old," he said finally. "She grew up in a religious community in rural Vermont. She has never—" He stopped, started again. "She has never had anyone at all." Theo was careful. "Has she said she does not understand what she signed up for?" "No." "Has she expressed any reservations?" "No." According to Sylvia, she was completely calm during the interview. She answered every question directly. She asked intelligent questions about the medical procedures. "Then she is a consenting adult who, Theo." Dominic's voice dropped half a register. It was not loud. It was quieter, actually, but it stopped the sentence dead. "If you had a daughter, and that daughter had never been touched by anyone, and someone asked her to undergo a medical process that is invasive by nature, that puts her body in the hands of strangers repeatedly over the course of a year, that involves hormone treatments and monitoring appointments and an embryo transfer and 9 months of physical vulnerability she has never experienced any version of before." He paused. "And she said yes because she wants to do something meaningful, and she needs money for her mother's barn roof." Another pause. "Would you call that fully informed consent?" The study was quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. A car passed, outside, on the street. Theo picked up his pen, set it down again. "No," he said quietly, "I would not." Dominic nodded once. He opened the folder again. He read her application materials a second time, more slowly. This was not a naive woman. That much was clear, even from a file. She had listed, in precise botanical terminology, her understanding of IVF hormonal protocols and their documented physical side effects. She had cited 2 peer-reviewed medical journals by name. She had asked, in the margins of the original application, 3 questions that the intake coordinator had noted were more sophisticated than those asked by most candidates. She had done her research. But Dominic knew something about the gap between research and reality. He knew it because he had spent 6 years processing grief as though it were a project with deliverables. He had read everything about loss. He had understood it intellectually. He had built a pharmaceutical research company partly in response to it, and not one word of that reading had prepared him for the actual experience of watching Renata die. There was knowing what a wave looked like from the shore, and there was standing in the ocean. Those were 2 completely different things. He was not willing to be the person who pushed someone into the ocean without first asking whether they understood the difference. He said, "I want to meet with her, personally, before we proceed." Theo looked up. "That is highly irregular. The agency protocols specifically schedule it. Dominic, the legal exposure alone if she—" "Schedule it, Theo." A pause. "I will need you to understand," Theo said carefully, "that meeting with her personally creates a relational dynamic that is very difficult to—" "Schedule it." Theo scheduled it. Claire Marsh was at the botanical garden the next morning, moving bulbs into cold storage for the winter. It was November work. Steady and repetitive and satisfying in the way that physical labor with a clear purpose was always satisfying to her. She was thinking about the intake interview. Specifically, she was thinking about the expression on the beige cardigan woman's face when she had answered the question about relationships. The woman had kept her own face carefully neutral, professionally neutral, but there had been something underneath the neutrality. Something that looked like concern. Claire had noticed it. She was not embarrassed by her answers. She wanted to be clear about that, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She was not embarrassed. She had not lived the life she had lived by accident or by default. She had chosen it, not in a grand, deliberate way, not as a statement or a stance, but in the small, accumulated way that choices happen when you are simply being yourself day after day. She was particular. She had always been particular. And she had not yet found anyone who was worth being less particular for. This was not tragedy. It was just fact. Her mother called while she was loading the last flat of tulip bulbs into the freight elevator. "How did the medical study thing go?" Ruth asked. She was in Vermont. Claire could hear the particular quality of a silence that surrounded her mother's house, the silence of fields and old wood and cold air. "Fine," Claire said. "I am still waiting to hear." "Are you certain about this?" "Yes, Mom." "You always were certain about everything," Ruth said. There was love in it. There was also worry. Ruth was skilled at putting both things in the same sentence. "I am certain," Claire said again. She loaded the last flat. She was not entirely certain. She allowed herself 4 seconds to acknowledge that. 4 seconds of genuine uncertainty, standing in the freight elevator with the tulip bulbs and the smell of cold soil. Then the elevator doors closed, and she pressed the button for the lower level, and she moved on. That evening, the agency called. The CEO of Hale Biosciences was requesting a personal meeting before any further steps were taken. Claire sat down on her couch. She thought, "That is unusual." She thought he found out. She thought, of course he found out. Medical screenings are thorough. That is the entire point of medical screenings. She thought, "I should feel embarrassed." She did not feel embarrassed. She felt something sharper, something that sat behind her sternum and pressed outward. She was angry. Good, she thought. Then he can tell me himself. He can look at me directly and say I am not suitable. He can do me that courtesy. She told the agency, "Yes, I will meet with him." She hung it up. She wrote in her journal that night for a long time. "He probably thinks I am broken, or sheltered in a way that makes me naive, or fragile. He does not know the first thing about what I have chosen, and what I have walked away from, and why. He has a folder with my name on it, and a note from a psychosocial intake interviewer, and he thinks he understands something about me. He does not. I know who I am. I have always known who I am. That is more than most people have. I know that for certain." She closed the journal. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark and thought, whatever he says in that meeting, I will be fine. She would be fine. She was always fine. The hotel near Back Bay was not where she had expected. She had expected his office, the kind of office a billionaire CEO has, enormous desk, floor-to-ceiling glass, the city laid out below like something he owned. She had prepared herself for that environment, for the deliberate imbalance of it, for sitting in a chair slightly lower than his and being looked at from a position of height. This was a private meeting room in a hotel. Round table, 4 chairs, a window with a view of the street, a pitcher of water, and 2 glasses already set out. Neutral ground. She noticed this immediately. She filed it. She arrived 6 minutes early. She was wearing her good coat, charcoal wool, slightly too large across the shoulders, purchased at a consignment shop 4 years ago for $32. She had not replaced it because it was warm and clean and served its purpose. Her dark hair was pulled back. She carried her canvas bag. She was sitting down and looking at the water pitcher when she noticed the smear of potting soil near the bottom of the bag. She had not seen it until that moment. She had been in too much of a hurry that morning. She almost stood up and left, drove home, changed bags, started over. She did not stand up. She set the bag on the floor with the soil smear facing away from the table. She ordered water from the server who appeared at the door. She sat with her hands folded and she waited. Dominic Hale entered at exactly the scheduled time. He was taller than she had expected. This was not relevant information, and she noted it as such immediately. He was wearing a suit that she recognized, from no particular expertise, but from simple observation. Cost more than a month of her salary. He had the face of a man who had not slept properly in a long time, not tired in a soft way, but carved, reduced to the essential lines, as if everything unnecessary had been worn away. He sat across from her. "Miss Marsh," he said, "thank you for coming." "Of course," she said. They looked at each other across the round table. He had spent 36 hours trying to figure out how to begin this conversation. He had drafted opening remarks on 3 separate occasions and deleted all of them. He had asked Theo for guidance, and Theo had said, after a long pause, "Just be a human being about it." So he said, "I wanted to meet with you personally because I believe you deserve more than a letter from my attorney." She waited. "The screening process surfaced some information about your personal history that I did not anticipate. Before we go any further, I want to make sure you fully understand what this process involves. Not theoretically, actually." Claire folded her hands on the table. "You mean the fact that I have never been with anyone," she said. The directness stopped him. Briefly, a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Then he recovered. "Yes," he said, "and you are concerned that I do not understand what I agreed to. I think," he said carefully, "that the contract describes procedures. It does not describe experiences. There is a significant difference between reading about something and living through it." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Hale, yeah," she said. "I am 27 years old. I have a bachelor's degree in botany from the University of Vermont. I have worked in horticulture for 4 years. I have read every document your agency provided. I have researched IVF protocols independently and consulted 2 peer-reviewed journals on hormonal suppression protocols. I have spoken with 2 women who completed gestational surrogacy arrangements, and I understand." She paused. "That my personal inexperience in one area of life does not mean I am incapable of making an informed decision about my own body." He was quiet. "You are angry," he said. "I am precise," she said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. Gone before it fully arrived. "Let me be honest with you," he said. "I am not here to withdraw your application. Medically, you are the strongest candidate we have screened. What I am asking is whether you have truly thought through what it means for someone who has never navigated any form of physical vulnerability with another person to undergo a process that is demanding and intimate and puts your body in the hands of medical professionals repeatedly over the course of a year." She was quiet for a moment. This was the most direct thing anyone had said to her about the process. The agency had been professional and efficient. The brochure had been optimistic. Even Sylvia Harmon, kind as she was, had framed everything in clinical language that kept a careful distance from the actual physical experience of being a person going through it. He was asking her to think about her body, her actual body, her lived experience of herself. This cracked something open, not wide, just a seam of light through a very narrow gap. "I have thought about it," she said. Her voice was slightly less sharp. "Tell me what you thought," he said. Not a command, a genuine question. She recognized the difference. She looked out the window for a moment. November Street. A woman walked past carrying an enormous bunch of yellow sunflowers and brown paper. Strange thing to see in November. "I thought," Claire said slowly, "that I have never used my body for anything extraordinary. I have used it to work, to walk through fields, to tend things that grow. I thought that carrying a child, even someone else's child, would be the most significant thing I could do with it, something that mattered beyond the boundaries of my own life." She looked back at him. "I thought about the money too. I will not pretend otherwise. My mother needs help that I have not been able to give her. This would change that." She paused. "I did not think enough," she admitted, "about what it would feel like to be examined repeatedly by people I do not know, with no reference point for that kind of physical vulnerability. You are right that I did not think enough about that part." This honesty cost her something. He could see it in the slight tension around her eyes, the way she had to push the words out rather than letting them come naturally. He nodded. "Thank you," he said, "for being honest." "I am always honest," she said. "It is more or less my defining quality." The almost smile again. This time it landed slightly further. He reached into the folder on the table beside him. He slid something across to her. It was not the contract. It was a photograph. A woman. Dark hair, warm eyes, laughing at whoever was holding the camera with her whole face. Not a polished smile, a full, unguarded laugh, the kind that takes over everything. "This is Renata," Dominic said. "My wife. She died 6 years ago." Claire looked at the photograph. "She wanted children. We tried for 3 years. The treatments were brutal for her. Her autoimmune condition made the hormone protocols dangerous. She never carried to term." He paused. "When she was dying, she told me, 'Don't let it end with us.' She meant the family we had planned, the continuation of something." Claire looked up from the photograph. "I have spent 6 years building something she would have been proud of. The company, the research foundation, the work." He gestured slightly at the folder. "And the one thing I have not been able to build is this. I have gone through this process 3 times with other candidates. Medical incompatibility, once. Personal circumstances, twice." He looked directly at her. "I am not a sentimental man, but I want this child to exist, and I want the person who carries them to do so with genuine understanding of what they are choosing. Not because a contract permits it, because they actually want it." Claire closed the photograph folder slowly. She looked at the image one more time before it disappeared under the cover. He loves her still, she thought. 6 years, and he is still standing inside that loss. He has built everything around it. The company, the work, this whole process. It is all an extension of that one moment when she said, "Don't let it end with us." She recognized the quality of it, not the grief itself. She had not lost a spouse, but the particular way some people build their lives around a held breath, around a promise made at the very last moment that they are still trying to keep. She knew something about held breath. "Can I have 3 days to think?" she said. "Of course," he said. She stood. She picked up her canvas bag. She was halfway to the door when she turned back. "Mr. Hale, why did you want to meet me personally instead of simply sending a letter through the attorney?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I needed to know," he said, "if you were going to be all right." She looked at him. "I am going to be all right," she said. "That is the one thing I have always been sure of." She left. He sat at the round table for a long time after she was gone, the pitcher of water between them, her untouched glass, the photograph still on the table. He drove himself home, not with the driver, through the evening city, red lights and wet streets, the smell of his own car's leather, a coffee cup in the console holder that had been there for 3 days. He parked in front of the house on Beacon Hill. He sat in the car, the engine off, the street quiet outside, a light on in the neighbor's front window. He did not go inside right away. He sat and thought about the word fine, the way she had said it, not as reassurance, not as performance, as simple fact. The way someone states something true so often they have stopped needing anyone to believe it. "I am going to be all right," he thought. She has been saying that to herself for a long time. He thought, I wonder if she is anyone who says it back to her. She drove north the next morning. She did not tell anyone she was going. She called in a personal day at the garden. She packed a bag at 6 in the morning, 3 days of clothes, her journal, the folder of documents from the agency, and she got in her car and she took Interstate 91 north out of Boston and she drove. She needed to be in the place where she had become herself. The Marsh property was outside Whitmore, Vermont. 800 people, a general store, a congregational church that had been on the same corner since 1843, and a maple candy company that had not changed its recipe in 50 years. The farmhouse sat back from the road on a hill that had been slowly settling for 2 centuries, giving the whole structure a very slight lean to the left that her mother said she had stopped noticing 30 years ago. Ruth Marsh was not expecting her. She opened the front door, looked at Claire's face for exactly 2 seconds, and said, "Come inside. I will make tea." This was what Ruth had always done. Not asked what was wrong, not pressed or probed or demanded explanation, just created warmth and space and let Claire fill it at whatever pace she needed. Claire sat at the kitchen table, the same table she had sat at since she was 4 years old. Pine, with a crack along one corner where it had been dropped during a move in 1991, the same yellow wallpaper with faded peonies that she had stared at through every breakfast of her childhood. The same crack in the plaster near the window that had been there, her mother said, since before she was born. She was here because she needed to think. Somewhere that was not her apartment in Somerville, with its efficient, self-sufficient quiet. She needed the table, the wallpaper, the smell of wood smoke, and her mother's chamomile tea. She had 3 days. She started with the practical. The money was real. It would clear the property tax, fix the barn roof, leave enough remainder to carry Ruth comfortably for 2 years without Claire having to worry. That was a concrete good, measurable. She could hold it in her hands. The medical process was demanding but manageable. She had done her research thoroughly. The timeline was 9 to 12 months from contract signing to delivery. The physical demands were significant. Hormone treatments, monitoring appointments, the embryo transfer procedure, and then the pregnancy itself. But she was healthy and strong. She had a high pain tolerance built from years of physical outdoor work in all weather. She could manage the demands. She moved to the harder part, what he had said at the hotel, about physical vulnerability, about having no reference point. She had spent the drive up thinking about those words, turning them over, testing them against her own interior. She was not embarrassed by her history. She needed to keep saying that clearly to herself, so it did not become something she had to defend. She had made her choices consciously. She had left the community she grew up in at 18 and gone to the University of Vermont on a scholarship and built her own adult life piece by piece. She had dated once, briefly, a man named Stuart in her second year of college who was gentle and unremarkable and who told her, after 2 months, that she seemed distant. She had thought about that assessment for a long time. She had decided, not distant, particular. She had particular standards and particular needs, and Stuart had not met them, and she had not been willing to pretend otherwise. She had never met anyone who met them. She did not consider this a failure. But Dominic's question had lodged somewhere it could not be dislodged. What does it mean to be physically vulnerable with people you do not know? She tried to feel it now, rather than think it. The monitoring appointments, a stranger's hands, her body being observed and measured and assessed by people who were professional and kind and completely unknown to her. The embryo transfer, lying on a table, the pregnancy, 9 months of her body doing something that had never done, watched and tended by a medical team for a child who would belong to someone else. She sat with this honestly. It was more than she had let herself feel before the meeting. It was significantly more. Her mother came in with the tea and sat across from her. "Ruth," Claire said. She called her mother Ruth when she was being serious. Ruth had always found this endearing in a way she never said out loud. "I am considering something that is going to require a lot from me physically, and I have been trying to determine whether I am genuinely ready for that." Ruth wrapped both hands around her mug. "What kind of something?" she asked. Claire told her everything. She told her, because she always had, because the Marsh women had an unspoken policy, absolute inside the kitchen walls, of honesty. Ruth had never once responded to truth with judgment, and Claire had never once withheld truth to protect herself from possible judgment. It was the agreement between them, never formally made, completely reliable. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Claire finished speaking, the kitchen was quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the last oak leaves. A branch scraped against the side of the house. The refrigerator hummed. "Are you asking me what to do?" Ruth said finally. "I do not know what I am asking," Claire said honestly. Ruth was quiet for another moment. "You drove 3 hours to sit at this table," she said. "You did not call me. You did not email. You packed a bag and drove here." "Yes," Claire said. "You came home because something in you needed this place, this table, this specific anchor." Ruth looked at her steadily. "Whatever you decide, that instinct toward home, toward something solid, is good guidance. Follow it all the way through. Whatever you decide, make sure you have decided it from this place, from the ground, not from your head up high somewhere." Claire looked at the crack in the plaster near the window. She had looked at that crack 10,000 times. "Okay," she said. "Okay," her mother said, and poured more tea. That night, Claire lay in her childhood bed. The ceiling had a water stain that had been there since she was 9 years old. She used to lie in this exact position and make it into a map of a country she had invented. The country had mountains in the upper left corner, and a river running through the middle, and a city near the coast that she had never named. She stared at the stain now. She picked up her phone, set it down, picked it up again. She opened a browser. She typed, "What does the IVF embryo transfer actually feel like physically?" She read for an hour. She read accounts from women who had gone through it, real accounts from forums and medical blogs, and one essay written by a woman who described herself as a veteran of 4 transfers. She read about the cramping and the strange intimacy of the procedure and the lying still afterward and the waiting and the way your body felt like something was happening inside it that you had no language for. She closed the browser. She lay in the dark. "I can do hard things," she thought. "I have always done hard things. The question is not, can I? The question is, should I?" She thought about the photograph, the woman laughing with her whole face. She thought about the way Dominic had said, "Don't let it end with us." She thought about what it meant to keep a promise to someone who was gone. She understood that in her bones. She had been keeping a quiet promise to her father for 15 years. The man who had worked this farm and loved these fields and died when she was 12, she kept it by coming back, by knowing the names of the trees, by learning the work. Some promises required a body to keep them. She understood that. Somewhere between midnight and 4 in the morning, the answer assembled itself. Not dramatically, not in one sudden moment of clarity, more like something growing, slow and steady and inevitable, the way crocuses push through frozen ground. Not because they decide to, because that is what they do. She would proceed. She would drive back to Boston in the morning. she would have her conditions. She called the agency from a rest stop on Interstate 91. The coffee was bad. The parking lot was wet. Her car smelled of the cedar sachets she kept in it to cover the smell of work clothes. "Tell Mr. Hale that I am proceeding," she said, "and tell him I have conditions I would like to discuss before we proceed to the contract." She hung up. She got back in the car. I am not doing this to him, she thought. I am not doing this for him. I am doing this as myself, with full knowledge of what it costs and what it requires and what it means. That is not naivety. That is the exact opposite of naivety. She drove south through the November hills. The trees were bare now. The fields were brown. But she knew enough about growing things to understand that bare and dormant are not the same as empty. Everything underground was still alive, waiting for the right conditions. Claire's conditions were 6 in number. She had written them first in her journal, in her careful handwriting. Then she had typed them on her phone during her lunch break at the garden, sitting on the bench outside the propagation house, with a thermos of coffee and the smell of late autumn soil around her. She sent them to the agency on a Tuesday. The agency forwarded them to Theo. Theo forwarded them to Dominic with a single line of annotation. "She is not messing around." Dominic read them at his office on a Wednesday morning. Condition 1. A single permanent point of contact on the medical team, not rotating staff. One specific physician who would be present for every appointment. She would not navigate a year of physical vulnerability with strangers every time. Condition 2. No photographs for any purpose, including internal Hale Biosciences records, without explicit written consent for each individual image. Condition 3. Full advance disclosure of all medical decisions before implementation. Nothing would be done to her body without her complete understanding and agreement. She would not be a passive participant in her own treatment. Condition 4. Monthly in-person or video meetings with Dominic himself, not with an attorney or an agency representative. With him. She was carrying his child. She needed to know who that person was, not to build a personal relationship, to ensure that when she handed this child to someone, she was handing them to a human being she had actually met. Condition 5. Full confidentiality from all parties regarding the personal details that had emerged in her screening. That information belonged to her. It was not medical data. It would not be discussed, referenced, or disclosed to any party not already informed. Condition 6. 50% of the agreed financial compensation would be placed in an escrow account in her name immediately upon contract signing, not contingent on delivery, not held as incentive. Her body's participation had value from the first day of the process, not only from the last. Dominic read through all 6 conditions. He read them again. He called Theo. "Accept all of them," he said. Theo was quiet. "All of them?" Dominic said. "Condition 4 is highly unusual," Theo said. "Monthly personal meetings with you specifically creates a dynamic that is very difficult to—" "She wants to know who she is doing this for," Dominic said. "That is a reasonable thing to want. It will make it significantly harder to maintain appropriate distance." "I know. Dominic." "Accept them, Theo." Theo accepted them. The night before the contract signing, Dominic's mother called. Margaret Hale, Margot to everyone who had known her for more than a week, was 71 years old and lived in Charleston, South Carolina, in the house her husband had built 30 years ago and left to her when he died. She was Southern in the particular way that meant she was warm and formidable in the same breath, and she had been worried about her son in a quiet, constant, undismissible way for 6 years. "Who is this girl?" she said. "Her name is Claire Marsh. She is 27. She is a botanist." A botanist. She works at a botanical garden in Concord. And you are actually doing this? Yes. You are really proceeding? Yes, Mother. Margot was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Dominic could hear the sounds of her house behind the silence, the grandfather clock in her hallway, the particular creak of her porch in the wind. Renata asked you to have a family, she said finally. She did not ask you to do it in isolation. I know. She would not have wanted... I know, he said again, more gently. I know. Another pause. I will worry about this girl, Margot said. I am telling you now so you are not surprised when I call her. You are not going to call her. I'm going to worry about her, Margot said, which was not the same as agreeing not to call. She can handle things, Dominic said. She is more capable than the file suggests. They usually are, Margot said. That has never been the worry. The contract signing was at the same hotel. Different room. The signing room was larger. A long oval table with good light and a sideboard with coffee and water. Theo was there. The agency representative, a competent woman named Susan Fielding, was there. Dr. Harmon was there. Claire arrived in the same coat. Different canvas bag, still slightly too large across the shoulders. She had her own printed copies of the contract, annotated in blue ink. She had read the document 4 times. She had color-coded her annotations by category: financial, medical, confidentiality, procedural. Theo, examining her annotations later, would tell Dominic, she caught a drafting error on page 31 that our contract attorney missed. I have been doing this work for 12 years. Dominic would look at the signed contract in his hands for a moment and think, of course she did. The signing took 40 minutes. Claire asked 7 questions. Each was specific and necessary, and she waited for complete answers before moving on. Theo answered 5 of them. Sylvia answered 2. Then they all signed. The agency representative signed. Theo signed. Dominic signed. Claire signed. They exchanged copies. Dominic and Claire shook hands across the table. Brief, professional. Her hand was cool and steady and firm. He noticed, and deliberately stopped noticing, that this was the first time he had touched her hand. The first time anyone in this entire process had made simple physical contact with her. He noticed she received the handshake without hesitation and released it cleanly, without lingering, the way someone does when they are practiced at managing their responses to the world, when they have learned to take what is offered and let it go without holding on. He recognized that habit. He had developed the same habit himself. He had not thought about what it meant until now. The hormone treatments began 2 weeks after signing. The IVF surrogacy protocol required a period of hormonal preparation, suppression, then stimulation, building toward the transfer. Claire's body was being asked to follow a pharmaceutical schedule that had nothing to do with its own natural rhythms. She had read about this. She had prepared. She was not entirely prepared. The fatigue was different from tiredness. It was a heaviness that sat specifically behind her eyes and in her lower back and came on at 3 in the afternoon, whether she was ready for it or not. The mood shifts were documented side effects that she understood intellectually and still could not fully manage experientially. She was in the propagation house on a Tuesday morning, pressing cuttings into trays, the familiar smell of damp soil and fertilizer, the humid warmth of the glass house against the cold November outside, when her eyes filled with tears. For no reason, not for any identifiable reason, just her eyes filled and the tears went before they could fall properly, and she was left standing there with a cutting in one hand and wet eyelashes and the low winter light coming through the glass. She looked at the tray. Hormones, she thought, documented side effect, elevated estrogen. Nothing is wrong. She kept working. but she noted it. Her body was already changing, already responding to a process that had barely begun. She was being changed before the most significant part had even happened. She called Dr. Harmon that afternoon. "Is the crying normal?" she asked. "I need to know if I should be concerned." "Completely normal," Sylvia said. Her voice was the same as it always was. Steady, warm, professionally even. "Your estrogen is significantly elevated. Your body is working very hard." "All right," Claire said. "Are you managing it adequately?" A pause. "I think," Claire said honestly, "that I underestimated how much this would feel like losing control of my own internal weather. I am accustomed to understanding what I feel and why. This is harder to parse." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "You are not losing control," she said gently. "You are learning a new terrain. That is a different thing." Claire turned this over. New terrain. Not lost. Just without a map I recognize yet. She wrote it in her journal that night. New terrain. That is the right framing. I am not lost. I am in new territory, and I do not have a map. And that is uncomfortable, but it is not dangerous. It is just new. I have always been able to learn new terrain. I will learn this one too. The first monthly meeting was, without question, awkward. This was the only honest word for it. Dominic had prepared questions, organized questions, a list of practical administrative items requiring confirmation, medical timeline, logistical needs, whether any contractual provisions required adjustment at this early stage, whether Dr. Harmon had flagged any concerns. He was prepared for a 30-minute administrative check-in. He was not prepared for Claire Marsh. They met at the same hotel. She had started thinking of it, privately, as Neutral Ground Hotel. In the slightly dry way she named things she had complicated, ongoing feelings about. The same private meeting room, the same round table. She arrived 4 minutes early this time, rather than 6. Dominic arrived on time. His assistant, who had scheduled the meeting as a consultation with a medical contractor, did not know the actual nature of the arrangement. That was how it had to be for now. He was aware of the irony of having an elaborate secret in a building he owned and ran. He went through his list. Claire answered each item clearly and efficiently. The hormone treatments were progressing on schedule. Dr. Harmon was an excellent point of contact. She had no logistical needs at this stage, no contractual concerns. Then there was a pause, and Claire opened her own folder. "I have some items as well," she said. "Of course," he said. "I want to understand more about the life this child will enter, not as surveillance, as context." She looked at him directly. "I am carrying this child toward a life built around a loss. I think I should understand that life, not personally, as relevant background." He had not expected this. He had genuinely not expected it. He had imagined the monthly meetings as administrative, practical, a checkbox and the contractual requirements that both parties fulfilled efficiently and moved on from. He had not imagined being asked to explain the context. He told her about Hale Biosciences, how Renata's autoimmune disease, a rare form that attacked the vascular system, had sent him into pharmaceutical research with a focus he had never had before her diagnosis. How the company had started as a single research lab in Cambridge and become, over 8 years, an organization with 4,000 employees and a portfolio of treatments that had meaningfully changed outcomes for patients with autoimmune disorders. How every single piece of it was motivated, at the deepest level, by her name. Claire listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What would you want this child to know about Renata, someday, when they are old enough to understand?" He stopped. It was such a specific question, and he had not been asked it before. Not in that form, not by anyone. He thought about it. That she laughed like it was her full-time job, he said slowly. That she argued with restaurant sommeliers about wine pairings, and was almost always right. That she read the last page of every book she picked up before she read the first. Because she said uncertainty about endings was a waste of emotional energy. He paused. That she made everyone in a room feel like the most interesting person she had ever met. He was quiet for a moment. That she fought very hard to stay. The room was quiet. Claire looked at him. "One more question," she said. "What do you want this child to understand about how they came to exist, when they are old enough to be told?" He had not thought about this. Not in these terms. "I want them to know," he said carefully, "that they were wanted with everything I had, that nothing was spared in bringing them here, that they were chosen before they existed." Claire nodded. "Good," she said quietly. "That is a good answer." Driving home, Dominic realized he had not spoken about Renata like that. With that degree of specificity, with that warmth, about the actual texture of who she had been, in years. He talked about Renata regularly, at fundraising events for the foundation, in interviews about Hale Biosciences and its origins, in the carefully shaped language of professional legacy. He had not talked about the way she laughed. He had not talked about the last page habit, which had driven him quietly insane and which he had loved completely. He got home. The house was quiet in its usual way. He went to her reading room. He did not go in there often. He had not changed it. The books were still on the shelves, with their bent spines. All the last pages read first. All the covers, slightly worn, from being opened at the wrong end. Her perfume still lived somewhere in the fabric of the chair by the window, not strongly, not enough to cause anything acute, just enough to know it was there. He sat in her chair. He did not cry. He was past the era of crying. That had been the first 2 years. Now what he felt when he was in this room was something different, a specific gravity, a weight that was not entirely unpleasant, the way ballast is not pleasant exactly, but is necessary. She would have liked Claire Marsh, he thought. He sat with the certainty of that for a moment. She would have liked her immediately. She would have asked her 17 questions about botany within the first 10 minutes and listened to every answer with complete attention. He thought, "I do not know what to do with that thought." He thought, "But I think it means something." Meanwhile, the treatments continued. The second month of the hormone protocol was, if possible, harder than the first. Claire was tired in a way that had a specific texture now. Not the general tiredness of physical work, which she knew and could manage, but a tiredness that came from somewhere inside the process itself. Her body was working on a schedule she had not designed. She kept working. She kept going to the garden. She kept her hands in soil every day because that was, she had known since she was 12 years old, the most reliable way to stay connected to something real. But she was aware, in a new way, of what she had agreed to, not with regret. She was clear about that. She was not regretting. But she was feeling it now in the full embodied sense that Dominic had asked her about in the hotel meeting. The experiential reality, as distinct from the intellectual understanding. He was right, she thought, standing in the propagation house one afternoon, with the hormone fatigue sitting behind her eyes. There's a significant difference between the two. I am glad he asked. I am glad I had 3 days to think. I am glad I am here anyway. Validation Whisper, Chapter 6. She wrote in her journal that night, "The body catches up on its own schedule, not mine. It catches up when it is ready. I knew this would be hard. I chose it knowing it would be hard. The difficulty is not evidence of a mistake. It is evidence that I chose something real. Real things are heavy. That is how you know they are real." The embryo transfer was on a Tuesday in February. Outpatient procedure. The clinic smelled of clean air and the faint chemical scent of medical-grade disinfectant. The procedure room was small and quiet. Dr. Harmon was there. A nurse named Carol, who had been present at all of Claire's appointments, was there. They were the only people in the room besides Claire. Sylvia had explained the procedure twice. Once in their meeting the previous week, and once again that morning before they began. Not because she thought Claire had forgotten, because she understood that hearing something again in the moment it is about to happen is different from hearing it in the abstract. Claire lay on the table. She stared at the ceiling. The ceiling was white and plain and had a small imperfection near the light fixture, where the plaster had been smoothed, but not quite perfectly. She thought, I always noticed the ceiling. The procedure took less than half an hour. It was not particularly painful. She had prepared for worse. There was pressure and discomfort and a specific strange sensation of something happening inside her that she had no prior experience to compare it to. And then Sylvia said, quietly, "It went perfectly, Claire. Everything went exactly as we hoped." Claire closed her eyes. There is a life now that was not here before, she thought, inside me. For now. In this temporary home, I am the bridge between what was asked for and what will walk in the world. She found this thought beautiful, not in a sentimental way, not in a way that made her feel emotional or romantic about it, beautiful in the precise, botanical sense. The way a seed's germination is beautiful because it is exact, because it is doing exactly what it was made to do, because it is the fulfillment of a specific purpose. She drove herself home. She called Ruth from the car. She did not tell her what had happened that day. She talked about the weather turning colder and whether Ruth had gotten the furnace serviced and whether the old maple by the barn had lost its last leaves yet. "You sound different," Ruth said. "I am tired," Claire said. "Not tired," Ruth said. "Different. Quieter somehow, like you just put something down." Claire thought about that. "Maybe," she said. She made soup when she got home. Lentil and carrot, from a recipe she had made 100 times. She ate at the kitchen table, with the journal open beside her, but did not write in it. She just ate and sat with the quiet and thought about the ceiling in the procedure room and the small imperfection near the light fixture. She went to bed early. She realized as she lay in the dark, calmer than she had been since this started. Something had happened, something real. And the waiting now was not anxiety. It was a different quality entirely. It was the waiting of a garden after planting. 2 weeks. That was how long before the blood test that would confirm whether the transfer had been successful. 14 days. In those 14 days, Claire's body was either doing something or it was not. There was no way to know. There was no symptom that was informative rather than misleading. There was only the waiting. She went to work. She tended the winter garden. She had her hands in soil every day. And she was grateful for it every day, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had chosen her profession correctly. At night she lay in bed, and she was aware of her own interior in a way she had never been before. Listening, not for anything specific, just listening. On day 10, her phone buzzed with a text from Dominic. This was not standard. They communicated through the agency or through Theo or in the monthly meetings. He had her number for genuine emergencies. The text said, "How are you doing?" She looked at it for a moment. She typed, "Fine, waiting." His response came quickly, "Me too." She stared at those 2 words, "Me too." She thought, he is also in this. He is also lying somewhere in this city, in the specific suspended quality of not knowing. He is also listening. She typed, "I have been thinking about what you said, about Renata reading the last page first." A pause, then, She said uncertainty was a waste of time. Claire typed, I disagree. Uncertainty is where all the important things live. Another pause, longer. Then, I used to disagree with her about that too. Claire sat with her phone in the dark of her bedroom. The city outside. The particular night quiet of her Somerville street. Not silent, never fully silent, but settled. A bus somewhere in the middle distance. A dog 2 buildings over. She smiled. She did not analyze the smile. She let it exist without examining it. Day 14. 7 in the morning. The blood draw clinic opened at 7. Claire was there at 6:58. Sylvia was there. Carol was there. They drew the blood. Claire went to the garden. She worked. She did not watch the clock because watching the clock was not a productive use of her attention. At 1:58, she was in the back room of the propagation house. Her hands were in a flat of soil. She was pressing lavender cuttings in with the same careful, practiced rhythm she always used. Small, green, patient things, the smell of lavender in the warm glass house. Her phone was face up on the potting bench. At exactly 2 o'clock, it rang. She did not answer for 4 seconds. She picked it up. Claire, Sylvia said. A pause. It is positive. Claire looked at her hands. Dirty. Soil worked deep under her fingernails and into the lines of her knuckles. The hands of someone who worked. Okay, she said. Congratulations, Sylvia said softly. Thank you, Sylvia, Claire said. Thank you. She hung up. She put the phone back on the bench. She looked at the lavender cuttings. I knew, she thought. I have known for 4 days. I could not explain how, but I knew. I have spent my whole life watching things grow. Maybe I know the feeling now from the inside. She sat with it, there in the back room, with her dirty hands and the smell of lavender and the warm glass around her and the cold February day outside the glass. She sat with the full weight of it and let it be what it was. Real, extraordinary. Hers for now, and then not hers, both of those things at once. Then she picked up the phone. She called Dominic's office. His assistant answered. Tell him, Claire said quietly, that it worked. That night was the hardest night. She had not expected that. She had expected relief. She had expected satisfaction. She had prepared herself for the possibility of grief if it had not worked. She had not prepared for what actually happened. She lay in bed, and her body knew something her mind was still catching up to. There is someone here, her body said. Simply, without drama, as fact, not hers. She knew that. She had signed the contract. She had agreed. She had chosen this with full knowledge. But the body does not know the contract. The body knows there is someone here. She lay in the dark and breathed. I love this child already, she thought. Not the way a mother loves. In the way a bridge loves what it carries. In the way a garden loves a seedling it knows will be transplanted. That is a real love, the love I have. I am not going to pretend it is not there, and I need to make sure that love does not become something that complicates this arrangement. Not for his sake, for mine. She wrote in her journal for 2 hours. She was more honest with herself in those 2 hours than she had been with anyone else in months. She wrote, I like him, not in a romantic way. I do not know him well enough for that, but I respect him and I find him real, in the way that not many people are real to me. He does not perform. He shows up at the table, and he is exactly who he is, compressed and careful and carrying a grief he has built an entire company around. And he is real, and that matters to me. I am going to have to be careful, not because I am fragile, because being careful is right. She closed the journal. She fell asleep with her hand on her stomach. In the morning, she moved it. But she let herself have the night. In March, Margot Hale came to Boston. She told Dominic on a Sunday evening, not asking, informing. "I will be there Wednesday," she said. "The monthly meeting is Wednesday," he said. "I know," she said. "Mother." "I will see you Wednesday," she said and hung up. He called Theo. Theo said, "There is nothing legally preventing her from attending a meeting that is not formally structured as a mediation or a contractual negotiation." "That is not helpful," Dominic said. "I know," Theo said. Margot arrived at the hotel at 1:55 on Wednesday afternoon. She was wearing a navy dress and the pearl earrings she had worn every significant day of her life for 30 years. She had her silver hair swept back, and her posture was precisely the posture of a woman who had been told, from the time she was old enough to understand, that how you carried yourself was the first thing people saw. She was sitting at the round table when Claire walked in. Claire stopped in the doorway for exactly 2 seconds. She read the room. Dominic had the controlled stillness of a man who has already apologized twice and is prepared to do it a third time. Margot had the composed, forward-leaning presence of a woman who does not apologize. Claire sat down. "Mrs. Hale," she said. "Margaret," Margot said. "Or Margot." "I have never been comfortable with Mrs. in informal contexts." "Margot," Claire said. They looked at each other. It was the particular kind of look that two specific types of women give each other when they first meet. A mutual, rapid assessment that is not hostile, but is thorough. "You are younger than I expected," Margot said. "You are exactly what I expected," Claire said. Dominic looked briefly at the ceiling. Margot smiled. A real smile. Sudden, and warm. Like a window being opened in a closed room. "I like her," she said to Dominic. "You have said approximately 14 words to her," he said. 14 was sufficient, Margot said. Then she turned back to Claire. "How are you feeling, truly? Not the version you give the doctors." Claire considered. "Tired," she said. "The first trimester was harder than I anticipated. The nausea was significant from week 6 to week 11. I am now in the second trimester, and physically I am better. Heavier, more aware of my own center of gravity." "The awareness," Margot said. "That particular quality. It does not leave you." They shared a look across the table that Dominic could not entirely interpret. "But it's a beasting wet ujak." Margot found Claire in the hotel lobby afterward. Dominic had stepped away for a phone call. It had not been, Claire suspected, an entirely accidental phone call. "He has not told you about the others," Margot said. Not a question. Claire was still. "The other candidates before you," Margot said. "There were 3. The last one, a woman named Diane, went 6 weeks into the process before the arrangement ended. She had developed feelings for Dominic. It became complicated, and he terminated the arrangement professionally. But it cost him considerably." Claire was quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Margot looked at her directly. "Because you are not Diane. I can see that clearly. You have considerably more self-possession. But I want you to understand that my son has been burned by hope before. He does not show it. He never shows anything. But when that arrangement fell through, he did not speak to anyone for 3 days." A pause. "He is invested in this, in the child, in the process proceeding without additional fractures." Claire absorbed this. "I am not going to fracture anything," she said. "I made a commitment. I understand what it is. I intend to honor it." Margot looked at her for a long moment. "I believe you," she said. She reached out and squeezed Claire's hand. Brief and firm. "Take care of yourself," she said. "Not for his sake. for your own. She walked back toward the meeting room. Claire stood in the lobby for a moment. She thought about Diane. She did not know her. She would never know her. But she recognized the logic. 6 weeks of shared investment in something profound and fragile. Of course, feelings could develop. Of course. She was not naive enough to think that kind of thing only happened to other people. She thought, I have already acknowledged this to myself. In the journal, I have been honest about it. I like him. I find him real. That is allowed. That does not become a problem unless I let it become a problem. She walked back into the meeting room. She sat back down at the table. She finished the meeting. She drove home slowly. The April evening, the city in early spring, the particular cold that came between the last real cold and the first real warmth. She drove with the window cracked slightly because she liked the air. She got home. She put the kettle on, and then she reorganized her bookshelf. She did not need to reorganize her bookshelf. It was organized perfectly adequately. She had organized it 3 months ago by subject, and then again by author, within subject, and there was nothing wrong with its current order. But she needed to move things with her hands. She needed the specific task of picking things up and placing them deliberately while her mind worked out whatever it was working out. She moved books for 40 minutes while the kettle boiled and the evening settled around her. Margot warned me because she loves him, she thought. That makes complete sense. I understand it. I do not need the warning in the way she thinks I do. I know what I am in this arrangement. I have known since November. I am the bridge. A very good bridge, built carefully, holding steady. Bridges do not fall in love with what they carry. They just hold and let it pass. That is what I will do. She put the last book back on the shelf. She made the tea. She sat down at her kitchen table. She wrote in her journal, I am the bridge. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is the exact right thing to be. I believe that. The 3rd trimester arrived like a declaration. There was nothing subtle about it. The body in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy is not quiet. It is a full announcement to the person inside it, to every room it enters, to every chair that is now slightly too low, and every night that is now navigated around a new center of gravity. Claire adapted. She moved differently at work. She transitioned from the heavy physical work of the propagation house to documentation, seed cataloging, the desk-based work of the winter and spring records. Her coworkers were kind and careful. They asked questions that were appropriate and did not ask questions that were not, and she appreciated both of those things more than she said. Ruth came to Boston in June. She arrived on a Sunday evening with 2 bags and a cooler of food from Vermont, preserved tomatoes and pickled beans and a jar of the maple syrup from the farm 3 miles from their house. She sat up on Claire's couch with the efficient, unobtrusive comfort of a woman who had been the main support system of her household for 20 years and knew how to be present without being an imposition. She went with Claire to the prenatal appointments that were designated for family. She held Claire's hand in the waiting room. She did not say, I wish this baby were yours. She said, you are doing a good thing, a genuinely good thing. Claire found this more sustaining than almost anything else anyone said to her during those months. The 7th monthly meeting was in June. Claire was 32 weeks. By the 7th meeting, the awkwardness was gone. It had dissolved sometime around the 3rd meeting. Gradually, the way things that are forced into contact long enough eventually find their natural relationship with each other. They had been sitting at this table for 7 months. 7 sets of questions and answers. 7 accumulations of knowing how the other person's mind moved. The pauses before important things, the particular way each of them signaled that something mattered without saying directly that it mattered. She sat down. They went through the practical business first. hospital preferences reviewed, the birth plan confirmed, logistics of the immediate postpartum period. Dominic had prepared the nursery. He had hired a night nurse for the first 3 months. He had, he said, somewhat awkwardly, also spoken to his mother about coming to stay for the first 2 weeks. Margot will be helpful, Claire said. She will be overwhelming, he said. She will be both, Claire said. That is her particular gift. He almost smiled. They finished the practical items. Then there was a pause. Claire, he said. She looked up. How are you, actually? It was the 7th time he had asked this, and it landed differently today. Maybe because of the weight of the 32 weeks behind it. Maybe because they were two people who had been honest enough with each other, slowly and incrementally, that honesty had become the only register available between them. She was quiet. I am afraid, she said. He waited. Not of the birth. I have prepared thoroughly for the birth, and I am not afraid of it. Not of the handoff. I know what it is. I chose it. I would choose it again. She looked at her hands on the table. I am afraid that when this is over, I will go back to my life, and my life will be the same size it was before. And I will be a different size now, and those two things will not fit together. The room was quiet. I think, she continued, that this process has changed me in ways I did not fully account for. I am more open than I was, more aware of my own interior. Some of that is the hormones, but not all of it. She looked at him. You have done some of it. The meetings, you being a real person at this table. That changed something. He was very still. I am not saying that to complicate anything, she said quickly. I am saying it because it is true, and I do not lie. I am not asking for anything different from what we agreed. She paused. This is the last meeting before the due date. I did not want to finish this without being honest. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Can I be honest too? Please, she said. I have spent 6 years building a life that is professionally enormous and personally very small. I told myself that this was correct, that I was honoring Renata by focusing on the work, by building what she would have been proud of. He paused. This process. The meetings, you. He stopped, reorganized. You have asked me questions that no one has asked me in years, about Renata, about what I want this child to know, about who I actually am, as opposed to what I have built. He looked directly at her. I do not know what to do with that. I do not know if there is something to be done, but you deserve to know that I have valued this, unexpectedly and genuinely, more than I anticipated. The room was very quiet. That is a good answer, Claire said softly. He looked at her, and this time the smile arrived fully. Not almost, not the corner of it, not the suggestion. A real smile, brief and surprised, as if it had gotten past his defenses while he was occupied with being honest. She noted it. She filed it somewhere she would be able to find again. She was walking to her car when he came after her. Claire. She turned. He stood on the pavement outside the hotel entrance. The June evening around him. He looked, not awkward, he did not do awkward, but uncertain in the specific, careful way of someone choosing their next words with unusual attention. The child's name, he said. I have been thinking about it. All right, she said. I wanted to ask. He paused. Not a request, a thought. If you had a thought about a name, she was surprised. She stood there and thought. If it is a girl, she said, Wren. I have always thought that was a good name, small and strong, and not particularly concerned with being noticed. He looked at her for a long moment. I will think about it, he said. She nodded. She got in her car. She drove. She thought, that is going to be the baby's name. She thought, I am going to be all right. Not the automatic version she had always said. The version that had been true for a long time, but not felt. This was the felt version. I am going to be all right. Different. Fuller. From the ground. The birth was on a Thursday in the second week of August. Boston in August is heavy with heat, and the particular dense quality of air that has been warm for too long. The hospital was air-conditioned to an aggressive chill that Claire appreciated more than she had expected to. Ruth was with her. She had been in Boston for 2 weeks already, sleeping on the couch, making breakfast, going on the slow evening walks that the third trimester had made Claire's primary exercise. She had held things together in the particular way she always held things together. Without announcing it, without demanding recognition, simply by being reliably present in all the ways that mattered. The birth plan was followed in every detail. Dr. Harmon was present. Carol was present. The team was the team Claire had met across many months of appointments. No strangers, no rotating staff, everyone known. This had been the first condition, and it was honored completely. She had prepared for this for months. She had read and researched and attended a birth preparation class and practiced the breathing techniques until they were automatic. None of that made it easy. Of course it did not. She will say, afterward, to anyone who asks, it was the hardest physical thing I have ever done. I understand now, in a way I could not understand from research, why it is called labor. I understand the word completely. She will also say, it was extraordinary. Not beautiful in the evasive way that word is sometimes used to avoid saying difficult. Extraordinary in the precise, literal sense. Beyond anything ordinary, beyond the reach of prior experience or anticipation. Her body did something it had been designed, somewhere deep in its structure, to be able to do. And it did it. At 3:47 in the afternoon, a girl was born, 3.4 kilograms, a full head of dark hair. Renata's dark hair, Sylvia would note quietly, it was remarkable. And from the first minute, a particular quality of stillness, a watchful, attentive quiet that was all her own. Claire held her for 8 minutes. 8 minutes was what they had agreed. Enough for skin-to-skin contact, enough for the transition to happen with gentleness rather than abruptness. Enough time to do what needed to be done without making it harder than it needed to be. She held her. She looked at her face. I carried you well, she thought. You were cared for in here. You are going into a life with someone who has been waiting for you for 6 years, who has built everything around the promise of you. You are loved before you understand what love is. Go be that. Then she looked up. Dominic was standing at the side of the room. He had been there since she was born. Not close, giving Claire the space, but present. He was wearing clothes that were slightly less precise than his usual. He had been here all day, waiting, and his face had the particular controlled stillness he usually wore. Claire looked at him. She nodded. He came forward. Sylvia helped with the transfer. And Dominic Ashford Hale held his daughter for the first time. Something happened to his face. Claire saw it. She had never seen this man's face do this. Not in 7 months of meetings. Not in the hotel room with Renata's photograph. Not in the study with Theo. Not anywhere. Every layer of it went. The control, the compression, the careful architecture of a man who had learned to keep everything pressed small. All of it dissolved in the space of 1 second. He was simply open. He stood there, holding this small person with dark hair and watching stillness, and he was open, unguarded, undone, in the best possible way, present in his own life in a way he had not been present in a very long time. Ruth, standing beside Claire, reached over and took her hand. They stood there. the two of them, mother and daughter, holding hands in the afternoon light of an August hospital room. Claire's eyes were wet. She let them be wet. This is the right feeling, she thought. This is not loss. This is completion. This is what it looks like when something that was supposed to happen finally happens. This is what I was the bridge for. Gumch. Later, the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet after something large has happened. Ruth had gone to find coffee and to call her neighbor in Vermont, who was feeding the cat. Sylvia had stepped out. The medical team had done what the medical team needed to do. Claire was alone. She lay in the hospital bed, in the clean sheets and the particular amber light of a late summer afternoon coming through the window. Everything outside was still hot and golden. In here the air was cool and the room was quiet, and she was, for the first time in a long time, completely still. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the barn roof in Vermont. It was fixed now. The escrow had cleared the previous month, and Ruth had hired the contractor, and the work was done. She thought about the tulip bulbs she had put in the cold storage in November, which would be planted in October and would come up in April. She thought about the lavender cuttings in the propagation house, which would be ready for the spring sale by March. She thought about the water stain on the ceiling of her childhood bedroom, the map of the country she had invented, the mountains in the upper left, the river through the middle. She thought, I am the same person who drove to Vermont in November and sat at the kitchen table and asked her mother for something she could not name. I am also a completely different person. Both of those things are true simultaneously. I have checked. She thought, I did not come here to find something. I came here to do something. I did it. But I found something anyway. Myself, larger, more honest, more capable of being known than I was a year ago. That was not in the contract. But it is real. She closed her eyes. She slept. 3 weeks later, October beginning to suggest itself in the air, not present yet, but hinted, the quality of the light changing slightly, the first early turning trees. A knock at her apartment door. She opened it. Dominic was standing on the landing. He was wearing a jacket she had not seen before, dark green, slightly more casual than as usual. He had come without a driver. She could see, through the window at the end of the hall, the car parked on the street below. He was holding a small plant, gypsophila, baby's breath, small clusters of tiny white flowers on delicate stems, persistent and uncomplicated, hardy in almost any condition. One of the first things that came back in spring after a hard winter. I looked it up, he said. The language of flowers. This one means everlasting. Claire looked at the plant. She looked at him. Her name, she said. Rin Renata Hale, he said. Claire was quiet for a moment. She felt the name settle somewhere. Right. Correct. The way things feel when they have landed in exactly the right place. Can I come in? He said. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He set the plant on her kitchen table. He stood there for a moment looking at it, then at her, with the particular look of a man who has prepared for something and realized, standing in the actual moment, that preparation only takes you so far. I do not know how to do this correctly, he said. I want to be honest about that. I have done many things correctly in my life. I am skilled at building processes and executing them. I do not know how to do this particular thing. What is this particular thing? She asked. I would like, he said carefully, to continue meeting with you. Not because the contract requires it, because I would like to know you. As what? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. I do not know yet, he said. I think that is a question that needs to be answered slowly, very slowly. If you are willing to answer it slowly. She looked at him. She thought, He is not asking me to be Renata. He is not asking me to fill a shape that already exists. He is asking me, genuinely asking, what shape I am. He wants to know the actual thing, not the useful version of it. That is the right question. That is, in fact, the only right question. I work until 4 most days, she said. I walk in the Fenway Garden on Saturday mornings. I make very good soup. He waited. I am particular, she said. I have always been particular. I do not pretend otherwise, and I am not going to start. I know, he said. And I am... She paused. New to things. Still, in ways that require patience from anyone I spend time with. I have patience, he said. In some areas. I have noticed. A small silence. Tea? She said. Yes, he said. Thank you. She put the kettle on. He sat down at her kitchen table, the small round one by the window that looked out onto the street and the October light coming through the elm tree across the way. He sat there with the gypsophila plant between them, and neither of them entirely certain what came next, neither of them pretending to be. She got down 2 cups. She put tea in the pot. She stood at the kitchen counter, with her back to him for a moment, waiting for the kettle, and she thought, I am glad. That is all. Simply, plainly glad. Not because everything was resolved, not because the future was clear, because something had opened, and she was standing in the open space of it, and it was not frightening. It was possible. She wrote the last entry in the journal on a November afternoon. Exactly 1 year after the November afternoon she had first driven north to Vermont to think. She sat at her kitchen table. The plant was on the windowsill, still alive, hardy as advertised. I began this year thinking about usefulness, she wrote. I thought that was sufficient, to be of use, to do something meaningful with a body I had always treated as a tool rather than a home I actually lived in. I was not wrong, exactly. Being of use is good, it is real, but I learned that my body is not a tool. It is a fact, a permanent feeling, intelligent fact that knows things before my mind does. It knew the transfer had worked before any blood test confirmed it. It knew what the 8 minutes meant before I had words for it. I learned that inexperience is not a deficit. It is a kind of integrity, a refusal to perform what has not actually been felt. I learned that a man who has been living inside his grief for 6 years can, given the right knock on the door, step outside it. I learned that love has more shapes than the ones we name. Renata Hale is 3 months old. I have seen her twice, once by arrangement and once because her father sent me a photograph at 11 at night. Just her face, no caption, and I sent back. She looks like she is thinking something very important. He sent back. She does that frequently. I sent back. I know where she gets it. He did not reply to that, but he came over the following Saturday with coffee, and we sat at this table for 2 hours and talked about Renata's books, which he is going to read to Ren when she is old enough. All of them. Last page first or first page first. He has not decided. He is thinking about it. I told him I thought she should get to choose. He thought about this for a long time. Then he said, "You are probably right." That is a sentence I did not expect to hear from Dominic Ashford Hale on a Saturday morning in October. But that is what happened. I am larger than I was. The life I came back to fits me now. I was afraid it would not. I was wrong about that. The life was not too small. I was the one who needed to grow into it. You usually do. That is the only thing I know with certainty that I did not know a year ago. You usually have more room than you know. Go find it. Take your time. Be honest about what you find. That is all. That is everything.
We just watched 2 people do something very difficult. Not fall in love. Not save each other. Something harder than that. They chose to be honest. Quietly. consistently, without drama, in a world that rewards performance. They chose truth. And I want to sit with that for a moment before we go. Claire Marsh came into this story carrying something most people would call a disadvantage. She was young. She was inexperienced. She had lived a small, quiet life that the world does not particularly celebrate. And a powerful man looked at her file and thought, "She does not qualify." But here is what Claire knew that the file did not say. She knew who she was. She had always known. Not because life had been easy for her, not because she had been everywhere and done everything, and collected enough experiences to feel entitled to her own identity. She knew because she had been paying attention to herself, to what mattered, to the difference between what she was told she should want and what she actually wanted. That kind of self-knowledge, quiet, earned, unperformed, is one of the rarest things in the world, and it is available to every single one of us, not at the end of a journey, not after the right relationship or the right achievement or the right amount of time. Now, you already know more about who you are than you give yourself credit for. Dominic came into this story as a man who had confused building with living. He had constructed something magnificent around his grief, a company, a legacy, a process for getting what he wanted without having to feel the wanting. He had done everything right, and he was completely alone. What Claire gave him, before she gave him a daughter, was a question. Who are you, actually? Not who have you built? Not what have you achieved? Who are you, as a person, sitting across a table from another person? He had not been asked that question in years. Most of us have not been asked it recently enough. And when someone asks it, genuinely, without agenda, simply because they are honest enough to want the real answer, something opens, something that has been closed for a long time. Sometimes all it takes is one honest person across a table. This story is also about what it means to give something away. Claire carried a child for 9 months. She felt that child grow. She loved that child in the way she described, the way a bridge loves what it carries, the way a garden loves a seedling it knows will be transplanted. And she put that child in the right hands, and she walked back to her life. Not diminished, not broken. Larger. That is the part of this story I want you to carry with you. The things we give, genuinely, with full knowledge of what they cost, for the right reasons, do not empty us. They expand us. Every time you have given something real, your time, your care, your honesty, your presence, every time you have shown up for someone else at a cost to yourself, you did not lose something. You grew into more of who you are. That is not a consolation prize. That is the actual reward. And finally, this, Claire told herself from the very beginning, I am going to be all right. She said it when she was uncertain. She said it when she was afraid. She said it in the parking garage when she sat alone for 20 minutes and did not cry, but needed to sit. She said it so many times that eventually it stopped being something she needed to say, because it had become simply true. I am going to be all right. If you are in a hard season right now, if you are carrying something heavy, something uncertain, something that is changing you in ways you did not anticipate, I want to offer you that sentence. Not as reassurance from the outside, as a truth you already know on the inside. You are going to be all right, not because nothing is hard, because you have more room than you know. You have always had more room than you know. Go find it. Final note. This content was researched, constructed, and manually edited by our team, built with intention, shaped with care, and offered to you with the belief that stories told honestly can change the way we see ourselves and each other. Every word here was chosen deliberately, not generated carelessly, but crafted with the reader in mind. We hope it found you at exactly the right moment,